what we've got here, there's a master switch which basically lights everything up. There's pressure lights that if your oil pressure drops below, the lights come on. There's undercarriage indication, which means your wheels, tells you whether your wheels are up or down and locked. There's a tail wheel and the two mains. So it's what's called a tail dragger aircraft, so there's always a tail wheel. We have bomb doors indication, so there's nothing worse than flying along and your bomb doors are open. There's pump switches, left and right boost pumps, so that tells you that your fuel is being pressurized into the engine. This is a fuel injected engine, so we need to have the boost pumps on to start. Then the engine pumps can take over, or you can leave them on, but it's best to leave them off when you're running the engine. Nav lights, so that's your indication lights to everybody around you when you're flying at night. This will be a day aircraft, so you'll hardly need to use those, but you still need to keep them on when you're flying in dusk and such forth. Pitot heat, that's the heat to the airspeed inlet, so your airspeed is like a tube that picks up air pressure, and that keeps the end of the tube nice and warm so it doesn't freeze up, and you always have a good indication of your airspeed. These are Rosin, it's called R-E-S-I-N, Rosin Lights, which are the British version of the ident light for both formation flying and just close formation. It basically lights up two lights, one on the wingtip, one on the top or the belly, and the people in the formation can line their aircraft up with yours. We got fire warning switches, so if there's a fire on the engine, these lights will come on because it connects two wires when they melt together, and the light comes on. I can test the loops of each individual fire system, so it basically simulates a fire, and this light does light, so I know that my system is working. I've got feathering switches, which if you have a problem, your engine shuts down, but you want your prop to feather so that it doesn't what's called windmill. If it's windmilling, it can cause problems for flying. So this is for feathering. Then we have the extinguisher switches, which are guarded. There's always a guard on the extinguishers, so nobody can accidentally push them and blow what's called a squib bottle. It'll inject some retardant into the engine and make a mess of everything. And it's very expensive to recharge them again. So the Nav Heading Lamp, it's typically on the nose, but we kept it off just for looks. It's a big bulbous nav light that they sometimes had on Mosquitoes, which would tell the tower, I guess, a color that which aircraft it is. If it's coming in at night, you just didn't have an enemy aircraft coming in, it would be an augment to the landing lights. Then we have the belly ident lamps. So from way up in the air, you can possibly make out a red, a green, or an amber light, and they're on the belly of the aircraft, and depending on the code of the day, they would light up whichever lights that they were supposed to, again, for friend or foe identification. So we have those working, and they're on here. Then I have my generator switches, which basically turns on or off the generators. 2 amp meters. The voltmeter is here, so what happens sometimes is if the voltage of the generator jumps up too high, you need to shut off the generator, and that'll be a fault. So that just helps us check to know whether or not the generators are working right. These ammeters just tell you the output of each generator, so if one's doing more work than the other, you can figure it out and balance them. These are the fuel gauges. So on this particular aircraft, it has 4 wing tanks, which are in the wing, and then 1 belly tank. You can carry an external belly tank, but not on this particular aircraft. On this Mosquito, it has filters. When the aircraft is on the grass runway, you can imagine how much grass is being kicked up by the propellers, or gravel, or whatever it's landing on. And so there's some filters on the intake that deflect both the gravel going into the intake as well as the dust particles. So especially in the South Pacific, when the aircraft were flying around New Guinea, a lot of that area was very tropical, and you'd have all sorts of stuff flying into the intakes. So we have both the filter, so that's like in your car you have an air filter for your car, plus there's a hot cold air intake. So if you're flying on a winter day, you need to have the engine a little bit warmer than usual, and so there's a way of ducting the air from around the engine into the carburetor, so it warms it up just a hair above what's ambient outside. So that helps on a cold winter's day. Then we have a clock. Most aircraft don't have them, but for this particular one it did. So we're throwing a clock on here, and it's used for navigation. So you can tell how far you've flown in a set amount of time, and then you can judge when to turn. So especially for a bomber, navigation purposes and triangulation was very important. So you always timed your leg of your flight and then changed direction, and you always ended up, or hopefully ended up, over your target. Altimeter, we updated the altimeter because there's a standard now that must be met. So we had to put a new altimeter in. We couldn't go with the original one. And this gets calibrated every 2 years. The turn and bank indicator is a very standard instrument that just tells you if you're in a slide. And you try and always keep the ball in the middle. That's where that phrase comes from, keeping the ball in the middle. That means you're in a coordinated turn and you're not sliding, and it feels different when you're flying that you're not in a coordinated turn, because it just doesn't feel right. This is the directional gyro, so this is kind of like a compass. Then you've got your horizon. Right now it's caged, so it's locked. And these are vacuum-driven instruments, so not electrical, but vacuum. And there's some pumps on the engine that provide that suction, and it drives gyros. And these, again, try and maintain their position in space. We've got a vertical speed indicator, and this one's set for plus and minus 4. The reason for that is most aircraft is plus and minus 2. Their vertical speed capability is not as great as a Mosquito, and some jets have plus and minus 6. Then we've got all our engine gauges on the left-hand side here. We've got outside air temp, suction gauge, an RPM gauge for each engine, a boost gauge for each engine, which is measuring the manifold pressure within it. These have 2-stage superchargers, which we've disengaged, and the only time that you would ever run a supercharger is at high altitude. It would exceed the boost rate limits of the engine if you turn them on too low to the ground, just from the volume of air within the engine case. I have oil pressure, I have oil temp, and I have radiator temp. So these particular V12 Merlin engines run on a radiator fluid. It's like a car engine. And so we have to monitor the temperature of that radiator fluid, make sure it doesn't get too high, or you might have a problem within the engine. We have a brake pressure gauge. So it's a differential pressure gauge, which means that these, as aside from having electrical systems, hydraulic systems, this also has pneumatic systems, which means there's air pressure. And so our gauge here has to monitor that air pressure. And if you don't have enough pressure to stop, you're not going to stop the aircraft on the runway. We have oxygen air cylinder pressure. We've got a blinker here to tell you that there's actually pressure in the line for the oxygen. We've got a flap gauge to tell you what angle the flaps are at, so that's electric. The landing light controls. So on this particular aircraft, the landing lights come out from underneath the wings, and they swing down on actuators instead of being on the leading edge of the wing and just showing through a clear piece of plastic or plexiglass. These landing lights actually move on motors and on gearing mechanisms that bring them down out of the wing. It just helps the aircraft fly a little faster. All the British wiring was exposed in this particular aircraft, and in the American-built fighters of the time, most wiring was behind some sort of an access panel or a conduit that was a metal box, within the side of the aircraft. And on this particular aircraft, it's totally exposed, so you really have to sheathe the wiring to protect it from getting scratched and dented from, be it belt buckles or tools, or you name it. Anything that's moving in here can possibly rub on the wire and chafe it through, and then you got yourself a fire. So we have to be really careful about that sort of thing and make sure it's all safe. So.